Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the elements of humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Rubik. Hi, everybody. I've always been interested in leadership experiments. And I think if you are somebody that enjoys a good case study, then today's episode might be the right episode for you. It also might be right for you if you meet any of these criteria. If you've ever been vaguely dissatisfied with reviews, if you love retrospectives, if you've ever even thought the phrase organizational observability, if any of those things sound interesting to you, this might be the episode for you. Today's episode, I'm talking with Brent Miller. I worked with him for many years at New Relic. He engaged in a fascinating piece of work that we call team health. They were team health self-assessments. And they were a very successful approach to learning things that often organizations are not set up to hear. And it drove a lot of positive improvements at New Relic. I think it's a very, very interesting piece of leadership work and something I'm really happy to share with you. Brent was a principal engineer at New Relic, and he had the title organizational architect. He and I worked together on a large set of organizational improvements we called upscale. So you may hear that term a few times. I'm really excited to share this with you. Can't wait to get started. It's good to see you again.
It's nice to see you too.
Well, let me turn the subject to a topic I'm really excited to talk with you about, what you and I refer to as team health. And this was something that maybe I'll tell a little bit of the story as I remember it, and then maybe you can respond to that. We had this new idea of the team being the unit of work. And this started to really pervade the way we saw things. And at one point, Alex Croman came up with this idea of why don't we do reviews for teams? And everybody was like, reviews for teams? What a weird idea. And so all the directors proceeded to write a review for a team. And, it kind of makes sense. If the team is the unit of work, you want to provide good feedback, you want to give advice for how the team can improve. And so we went through this whole exercise. And for the directors, it was actually, I think, a pretty good practice because, it's what directors should have been doing anyway, is kind of like thinking about how their teams and their organization should be improving. But everybody else hated it. Like they thought it was a horrible, like they saw some value in it, but it was also like, oh my God, we're being judged by all the directors. And it was like V0 of this thing kind of went off the rails a little bit. And so after we got all the feedback about that, Alex was like, well, you're developing some engineering standards, which is like kind of like how engineering should work and what successful teams look like. What if we, instead of having the directors do it, have the teams self-assess against that? And I think you might have been involved in influencing that idea. I don't really remember exactly how that happened, but
yeah, what you're describing was outside of my view. When I got involved, Nick Benders, who was one of the VPs, I believe at the time, and I was reporting to him, Nick came to me and said, boy, do I have a challenge for you.
Oh, nice.
And the challenge was presented to me as, we had the directors try this, it was miserable, do better.
Yes. Yeah.
And what I remember him telling me was that it was very useful, but like every director had totally different standards. And most of the standards did not line up with what we were expecting the teams to do post upscale.
Exactly.
And I was engaging with the teams on the change management side, which is, in this new post upscale world, you have to act like a team. Let me help you with that. I think somebody felt like it was a good match for me doing that work to then take on these self-assessments. And so I thought it was a great idea. And I was very excited by it because there wasn't much in the way of prior art for us to do. And they specifically kept me away from what the directors had done.
Yeah.
So they're just like, Greenfield, go to town. And I was like, great, Greenfield project. This sounds fun. Let's have a good time here. And that's how the project landed in my lap. And I started out, and this was not purely my idea, so I would love to claim it, but I can't. But I started out with, let's try and figure out, what do we even say? What do we even mean when we say be a good team?
Yeah.
And so we had to start by aligning the organization, which meant all the leaders, on what a good team does. And so I scheduled interviews with everybody who had a director or higher title in the product organization who would give me time. And I sat down for a half hour and I took tons of notes. We put every one of those ideas that I got onto note cards and did a giant affinity mapping. And so I forget the exact count, but it was 300 or 400 cards I ended up writing out for this. And we boiled all of that down to a set of standards that we thought everybody would actually agree on. Workshop that with some of the directors and VPs and got feedback and polished it. But we came out with a list of, I think that first year was about 60 questions, 6 different categories, 10 standards per theme. So the 6 themes were healthy management, healthy software, healthy culture, focus on value, effective delivery, and self-determination. And I think it's important for the listeners here to say that that's what this particular company came up with, given its structure and goals at the time. And in a different company, we would have come up with a different list.
Yeah.
And some of what we talked about, I believe, is going to be very general and generic to any team building software anywhere. But some of it was very specific to us at the time. The focus on value, that was important for a team where you expect the team to be doing its own product management, which means they have to understand business value. If you're in an organization where the product managers are outside of the teams building software and the PMs have to understand business value, the teams don't necessarily. So that applied to us at New Relic. It may not apply to your organization. So keep this with a grain of salt. And then the other thing that we did is within the themes, we had some substructure. For healthy management, we had, 4 separate standards. Each standard had 1 to 3 indicators. So a standard for management was, our work is observable. Can the director outside the team know what we're up to? That's a great question. And one that I'm sure directors everywhere are like, oh, yes, I want to know this, right?
Yeah.
One of the management standards was, we understand our strategy and responsibilities.
Yeah.
And again, that was necessary because of the way that we decided to structure our teams. And that may not be true for everyone everywhere. As an example, for the indicators, for our work is observable, because that seems really generic and applicable everywhere. We had 2 indicators. The first one was, everybody on the team understands how decisions get made and why recent decisions ended up as they did. The second indicator was, team members know what the rest of the team is working on at any given time.
Mm-hmm.
So they're both really clearly about observability. And so once we had put together this bank of 60 questions or 60 indicators, we had every person on each team rate their team for each indicator. So the ratings were the same for every indicator. It was, this is true, never, rarely, sometimes, often, or always. I think those are the five levels. So it's just a question of, how true is this for you? And that gave us a lot of data, because every team has between 4 and 10 or 12 people. So every team, for every one of the 60 indicators, right, there's 8 to 12 evaluations. And so the question is, then what do you do with all that data? And what we did with it is, there was really 2 things. So the first thing that we did is we put together this kind of team health tiger team, which had a fair amount of overlap with the tiger team that was doing upscale, partly because they were the people who were trusted, and that's what we really needed. But partly because they were the people who were most familiar with the upscale intents. And so they were going to be very effective in conversations with the teams at speaking up for the system design. And so we had this tiger team. We had one person from the tiger team sit with every product team for 2 hours to talk about their results. And the first year we did it, it was all spreadsheets. Later, we wrote software to automate this. But that conversation essentially looked like we would look at every standard, which would have multiple indicators, but every standard, and say, here are the anonymized team results. So you had 2 people who said this happens often, 3 people said it happens never. So in that conversation, we looked for places where the team was not aligned with itself.
Mm.
So if you have somebody saying never and somebody saying always, are you looking at the same elephant? Yes or no? That's the real question we want to know. We would ask the team, somebody said never and somebody said always, like, why do you think there's a disagreement here? And we did it in a way so as to not put the individual respondents on the line. We're not saying, if you answered always, speak up now. Because if as soon as you out the individual responders, you're making it unsafe for them to ever answer this question ever again if they gave an answer that their manager doesn't like. And so in order to have these self-assessments be useful, they have to be honest. Anybody who's gone to therapy knows if you're not honest with the therapist, it's just not going to help. And in a sense, this was like group therapy for the whole org, right? It was a big moment of self-reflection. So we needed people to be honest with us. And so we had these conversations structured so that we would not out the individual respondents. So then we'd have a conversation like, why do some people say never and why do some people say always? And the goal in that conversation was to understand the situation. It wasn't to get people to change their minds, although some people did. So they're like, oh, I interpreted that question totally differently. Yeah, I'm aligned with you here. And they would change their answer on the spreadsheet in real time. But most often, it was just that different people were saying different things. Sometimes there'd be a split between more senior, more junior engineers who were just looking at the world totally differently. Sometimes the split was, well, the white guys say a thing and the non-white guys say something different. And it was always informative as to what was going on. So we'd have this facilitator sit with the team, go through this conversation for 2 hours about what was going on. And during that time, they were taking notes. Sometimes we'd have the facilitators pair up. So one would be running the conversation and one would be just taking notes, because that's really hard to facilitate and take notes at the same time. But either way, we came out of those sessions with a rough transcript of what was talked about. We would ship that transcript back to the team to say, hey, please edit. If we misrepresented what you said or missed something, please put it in there because we want it. So then, after we talked to all the teams, which took a while, then we're able to get that Tiger team back in a room. And then we reread all of our notes. And we read our notes looking for common patterns. And this was a very interesting exercise. So we're essentially scoring the notes for things that we were finding. And to give you a sense for what the things are that we were finding, that first year, one of the patterns we found, we called it the human SPOF, the human single point of failure pattern, where too much knowledge of a part of the software stack that team owned was concentrated in one person's head and not well shared across the team. So if that person left the team for good reason or bad, doesn't really matter. If they win the lottery or if they change teams or decide to quit software, it doesn't really matter. Either way, they've left the team. And the rest of the humans on that team are now exposed because they don't have the ability to manage this part of the stack. So this is a thing that people on the team really want to know about, especially the manager wants to know about. And that's an interesting pattern to find, because if you find that pattern on a team here or there, that's a local problem, they can fix it. If you see this pattern on 50, 60, 70% of the teams, now you've got an organizational issue that more senior leaders need to step up and address. And so that was the work that we did. Is we spent then, I think it was 2 or 3 days in a room just rereading everything, identifying patterns, and then bringing those patterns to light, and then going back and rereading the ones we'd already read to be like, oh, did the pattern we just identified appear in the first thing that I read yesterday, right? So once we got all that done, then we were able to ship those results back to the teams and say, hey, line manager, here's what we found for your team. The things that we found are prevalent in the organization at this rate, and in your corner of the organization at this rate. So we're able to let the line managers know, let the directors know, let the VPs know, here's what we found in your organization. And then we're able to cook all that together with a big statistical analysis of the actual scores people were rating their teams on, to produce a big report. It reminded me of writing my senior thesis as an undergrad. It felt like that level of work, where I was just inventing a thing out of whole cloth and then doing a bunch of analysis to then produce a big report at the end. And over time, as we did this through multiple years, we polished that flow, figured out some real gotchas. One of them being that in those group conversations with the teams, it's still not safe for some people to speak up. So we gave people a back channel access to their facilitators. So if there's a thing you want to say but couldn't say, come talk to the facilitator. And we made some guidance for ourselves for how to handle those conversations. The first question being, how much of your identity should I record? The answer often being none, please and thank you, which is totally fine because we wanted the information. That was the most important part. And then when somebody came to us to the back channel, we also asked about, and why didn't you feel comfortable bringing this up in the real meeting? Because there might be something there that needs to be addressed. Sometimes it's that the manager is the problem. Sometimes it was that it's not that the manager was the problem, but it's just it was not a safe space for that person to speak up. They couldn't speak up in a way that might point the finger at teammates. And so these are all real valid issues people have. And we need to know what's going on, because if we don't know, we cannot address it. So that's I think the broad strokes picture of how we did the analysis. At the end of the analysis process, I did a big town hall where I presented everything to the organization, wrote up the report. The report went out to everybody. And then how I dealt with the leadership team evolved. And so rather than talk about the early missteps, let's talk about where it got to. So in I did 3 years. In the third year, after I got the results, I shipped those around to the leadership team and said, here's the big stuff that we found. I think these top 3 really need your attention. And when I present these results at the town hall, for at least these 1 and 2, I want to say, here's what we found, and here's what the leadership team is committed to doing, so that you look like you're ahead of the problem rather than behind the problem. And that was a real learning. The first year I did not do that. I surprised them with a bunch of stuff, and I got into a bunch of trouble over that. And I think rightfully, but I also feel like I exposed a lot of the insecurities in the leadership team, that people really took it personally when I said, look, I did an x-ray of the organization and here's what I found. There's a contusion here and a broken bone there. They're like, not my baby. My baby has no broken bones. It's a human organization with hundreds of people. Of course there are problems in it. That's how these things go. No organization is perfect. That was interesting learning in the first year, that people really did take it very personally and felt very offended that I was pointing out issues. And I think it came from 2 places. One is people can be offended when you tell them their baby's ugly. And that's legit. But also, I think we dug up some things that were surprises. And the way that organizations filter information as it travels up the hierarchy filters out bad news. And when you say, here's all the bad news, people are like, whoa, I've never heard any of this. And that's very challenging for those leaders who pride themselves on knowing what's going on.
Absolutely. There was also an explicit, I don't know, I don't remember if we did this the first time around or if it was something we added as an iteration, but there was a specific part where we added where the team could basically ask for help or for support in certain areas. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I think we did that the first year. Is we had the line managers ask for assistance, and it didn't really work very well,
Oh,
because
really? I have such a
yeah,
different memory of that.
what I remember was that we got some very legit requests out of it,
Yeah.
but people felt that we were intruding on normal director to manager reporting structures. They'd be talking about this stuff on their one-on-ones, and like, why are you making me fill out another form? I'm just going to
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah.
it with my director. And in fact, what we found was people were very enthusiastic about the data. So I remember 1 year with how we were rolling the data out, we were giving the line managers a specific report about their team, and they were giving the directors a specific report about their org that was very reduced compared to what the line managers were getting. It
Yeah.
was really about, we found this shorthand pattern, like the human single point of failure, on 5 of your 8 teams. We found this pattern on 6 of your 8 teams. And we weren't giving them any of the details about the individual teams. And then
Yeah.
we gave all the details about the individual team to the line manager. And we said, do not share this report with your director because we don't want them to meddle in the specifics of individuals on your team.
Hmm.
And I sent that out, and not 5 minutes later, one of the directors was like, "Oh yeah, so my line managers showed me the report in our one-on-one." And this was because they were both so enthusiastic about it. They just wanted to dive in and problem solve.
Yeah.
And I realized, oh yeah, information moves around. You can't really hide it that much. And late in subsequent years, we tailored those reports a little bit better so that if they did get shared, it wasn't such a big deal.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to tell people, don't be enthusiastic.
Yeah. Well,
Like,
totally. I also just remember those reports were incredible sources of information. And usually afterwards, there was a lot of management work to do because it was like, oh, we've uncovered where our hotspot teams are and where the challenges are. Okay, what are we going to do about this and that? And oh, we're seeing this new pattern or this new thing that maybe we had some idea about, but now we know exactly what's going on. And so it really guided a lot of organizational work. Like you know how there's these like pulse surveys that go on.
the HR pulse surveys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've actually seen those be pretty effective. Like, those can drive a lot of really good results. But usually the reason we saw some sort of value out of those is because we read all of the comments and we went through those comments, saw some patterns, and then we're like, okay, for our OKR this quarter, we're going to just focus on the biggest pattern we saw or the thing that really needs to change. And for team health, though, it often was very much like, hey, this part of the organization really needs some attention and we need to handle, like, on call is really out of control in this part of the organization, so and so, you need to go fix that. And I thought it was kind of amazing. Like, I think in retrospect, like when I look at it from a kind of post ZIRP perspective, like, what company would invest very much time in this type of insight and observability into what's going on with your teams? Probably not a lot of companies. And I think, I mean, you did some investigation into other companies that had done it. I think like Atlassian had done something maybe a little bit similar. How do you know, what other prior work or other examples did you find? Not very
The
much, right?
there was not much. There was a lot to draw from the HR side with these kind of pulse surveys, but those were all about employee engagement, quote
Yeah,
unquote, which engagement is a very odd metric because it's easy to game, it's hard to measure, and it's even harder to do anything about,
yeah,
especially at an organizational level. Atlassian did have, and I believe still does have, publicly a very excellent kind of self-help team health resource. And
yeah,
we drew a lot of inspiration from that. And we started leveraging that in the later years of team health, where we're saying, like, if you're seeing this problem on your team, here's the thing that you can do.
yeah,
And that's very much how the Atlassian team health public information is structured. They would call them plays. Like, you got this problem, here's a play you can run.
yeah. It's a little
And
bit
those are
more
great.
like diagnostic and self help approach.
Yes, but with Atlassian, there was no formalism to the diagnosis.
Yeah,
It was, as a manager, you think you've got this problem, then run this play. There
yeah,
wasn't much support for, do you really have this problem?
yeah,
Or does your VP have this problem? Because if your VP has this problem, there's nothing you can do about it. It's
yeah,
above your pay grade. You do not have the levers to fix the organizational issues. And so you brought up the on-call example, and that was one that we found. It was very much in specific parts of the organization, but it was like all of SiteEdge.
yeah,
Why is all of SiteEdge always on call and being paged too much? If you're a line manager on one of the teams in SiteEdge, you're not going to be able to fix that. Because the problem is that SiteEdge has too much work and you're not able to get ahead of the reasons why you're getting paged.
hmm,
So you don't have the autonomy to clear your schedule to get that work done. You clearly know it needs to get done because you're the one who's been getting paged. Like, you know this problem. but you ultimately can't solve it. And that's why we needed that larger organizational view. And I think the second year of Team Health was a great example of that. The big result that year, which was quite a surprise, was we discovered that over 80% of the teams, I forget the exact numbers, like low 80s, 82, 83, something like that. 83% of teams told us that they could tell that their stakeholders were out of alignment. And they could tell because they were spending a lot of time resolving priority disputes. They were spending a lot of time mediating between requests that were conflicting for the team's time. And that was a very big surprise for the leadership team. I remember announcing that in the meeting with all the VPs, and just you could see the jaws lower a little bit as they all dropped at the same time. You're like, wait, what? Because they thought they'd been doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. And it
And
certainly had improved over the last couple of years. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
exactly, it
Yeah.
was so much better than it had been, and
Yeah.
yet 80% of the teams are telling us that they found that their stakeholders are out of control.
Yeah.
And that's not the phrasing that the teams were using, that's the patterns they were describing.
Yeah.
Right? And so we brought that to the leadership team. And they're like, oh yeah, we're going to fix this. And the next year it was gone. I think it was less than 10% of the teams the following year told us they had that problem, because the leadership team's like, we're going to resolve this. And they got together, they figured out where in the prioritization process and the work cascading process that happened, and they made the changes they needed to make. No one team could have done anything to touch that problem.
Yeah.
But the leadership team could, because it was at their altitude in the organization the problem was occurring. And that's why I think Team Health was super powerful, was because it was not just a local exercise.
Yeah.
It was both a local and a global exercise.
So one way I'd like to turn this discussion a little bit is towards like retrospecting on it a little bit. Like I've thought about the exercise I went through as I was kind of building out the engineering standards, and like I think in retrospect it was way too complicated. Like there was just, in a way, by being complete, it made it more complicated than it had to be. And I think if I was going back and doing it again, I'd probably just focus on the ones that we most needed to work on or something. Although the completeness really helped with Team Health, because it actually kind of provided a model for what great looks like. So I guess I'm kind of curious, as you were looking back on this, like let's say, you got a job offer tomorrow to go work at another company doing this work. What would you do differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Before I get into it, I want to say this is a meta retrospective.
Yeah.
Team Health is an annual retrospective for the organization.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where the value really comes from, right? It's like going in for an annual checkup.
And can I make a point on top of that? It's like agile software, we think of retrospectives as being totally essential, but I've sometimes heard people describe like their response to Team Health is, oh my God, that just seems like too much work, or oh my God, I can't believe you would do that. Like, think of the transformational information you get out of a complete company retrospective, basically. Like,
Yeah.
I guess it was an organizational retrospective. That's essentially what it was.
This example of the stakeholders being out of alignment is a great one.
Yeah.
You could have done a retrospective on every team and not figured out that that was going on. And the fact that it was a surprise to the leaders tells you how hard it is to see these problems when they're happening.
Yeah.
And so you go into the doctor for annual checkup, and I'm a man in my late 40s, I get my PSA levels checked for prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't do that, it's not going to change my health. My health will be the same, except that if I don't get the early indicator, I'm going to be in a real world of pain, right?
Yeah.
And what this does is it gives you the ability to see problems before they become major, to really track what's going on, and then to do something about it and know that what you did was effective.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that plug there, that I feel like something like this is a thing that we should do. And I've heard, and I heard a lot when I was at Relic about this takes so much time.
Yeah.
We asked every team for 3 hours. That is not a lot of time.
Yeah.
you asked for more time than that doing all hands.
Yeah.
What's more important to you? Broadcasting information one to many in a synchronous method that could be done with a blog post, or actually understanding something and making changes to how you work so you can do better.
Yeah.
I feel like one of these is a much more useful investment in time, right? And
Right.
I bet you can tell which one. The time complaint really boils down to I was being funded to do that. So it was really costing 3 hours per team and one FTE.
Yeah.
And my FTE was not just doing the team health assessments, it was also doing a lot of managerial support, team coaching, and that sort of work. Lots of liftoffs, which is actually there's probably a whole other podcast in there if you want to talk about liftoffs someday. And so I just want to make sure that we get this out for the listeners that it really is not that big of an investment in time.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, the investment we make in a platform engineering organization, we make similar calculations. We're like, okay, is having this person focus on this and the cost of the time that they might take from other people. And then you think of the value that they generate. So for you to be like essentially paying for yourself, you have to be, there's 50 teams with, let's say, an average of 6 people on each team, just to underestimate, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
the percentage impact you actually have to have on the organization. Like I would argue it was much, much greater than whatever minuscule percentage impact you had to have. So like, if you think about it in a logical sense, I think it's pretty clear that it was immensely valuable. But I think sometimes there's this subjective sort of reaction people have to things that feel squishy, or that, even though it's all about statistics and numbers and all these other things, that there's some sort of weird reaction you hear to
Well,
something like team health.
it's because if people haven't seen it,
Yeah.
it is squishy and it's very touchy feely. We're
Yeah.
talking about emotions.
Yeah.
We're talking about how the organization feels welcoming to me.
Yeah.
And this is one of those questions where white guys on the team will give a different answer than non-white guys on the team.
Yeah.
Right. And if you don't ask, you're never gonna know.
Yeah. In some ways, you could say that the like Nicole Forrestgren and some of her collaborators, like the work they've done around qualitative research, I think actually is probably a pretty good validation for the team health work, where like interviewing people about their work is as effective and maybe arguably more effective as a way of like sussing out the state of a system than a lot of the kind of pretend metrics that we often use. So I think it was actually a really a little bit of ahead of its time in some ways.
Yeah. To add to that, here's the thing I said at the time when we were doing team health was like I did all the statistical analysis on the individual responses that we got. So
Yeah.
we could see for every team, how did you answer to this standard, to this theme in the team health indicators? And I produced tons of distribution charts. We could see, oh, you're to the left compared to the rest of the org and all of that.
Yeah.
And what I said at the time was that was a statistical fig leaf, that the real value came from analyzing the conversations, finding those patterns,
Yeah.
and saying over 80% of the teams understand that their stakeholders are out of alignment.
Yeah.
That's the value. It's not knowing that you're 10% behind or ahead of some other group. That's not helpful.
Yeah.
And that statistical fig leaf was a fig leaf because it gave the whole project an aura of kind of intellectual rigor
Yeah.
that made people believe it more.
Yeah.
If I had just come out and said, here's the results of the conversational analysis, people would be like, that's conversation. You can't analyze that.
Yeah.
That's totally not
It's a
true.
lot
You
easier to
can't.
reject if it comes across as Brent's interpretation of everything he's read.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's a big challenge, right? And so for anybody who's out there who's thinking about doing a project like this at their company, keep in mind this is a thing you're going to encounter, especially because most engineering management used to be engineers. And so they have that engineering mindset where they're used to computers, which is to say numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's binary. It's one or it's zero. It's yes or it's no.
Yeah.
Humans are not like that. We are squishy and weird,
Yeah.
and I love us for it.
Yeah.
That is what makes life worth living, I think. Okay, so let's go back to your original question about if I was going to get hired to do this,
Yeah.
what would I do differently? So,
Yeah. I'd love to hear that.
so I think that the way we started, where I interviewed all the leaders to find out what is an effective team,
Hmm.
I think that is absolutely necessary. I would
Hmm.
not change that for the world, especially if
Hmm.
I was new at a company, because then I would meet everybody, right? And get
Yeah.
to understand them and the culture that I'm working in. And I would cook that again into a set of themes and standards. I believe that we would still be well served by doing the once a year in depth work,
Hmm.
but once a year is not enough.
Hmm.
And that's the challenge is it's too expensive to do it every quarter.
Hmm.
I do not think that would be a good idea because
Yeah.
mostly for these organizational level issues, they don't change that fast anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, managerial feedback loops are not measured in days, they're measured in weeks or months or quarters.
Yep.
And so doing that big, going in for your annual physical every 3 months doesn't make any sense. I would not do that.
Yeah.
However, if you go in and they're like, oh, your level for this number is too high, they're going to want you to go back in for a little checkup.
Oh, interesting.
And in the third year, what I was starting to work on, which never saw the light of day because I left New Relic, was I was working on a chat bot to ask one or two questions, but like every week.
Hmm.
So every week there would be one or two or three questions that were the same every week, and then one or two questions that were variable, or maybe the line manager could add a question for their team, or the director could add a question for their teams within the organization. And you just get a little Slack message with, and it's just like emoji response 1 through 5. Tell me how you feel. So
Oh,
it would
wow.
take the individual respondent 5 to 10 seconds to respond to, like almost nothing.
Yeah.
But we could do that and without surveying everybody every week, which again, we would get survey fatigue. People would just stop caring. But we could target those, hit every person maybe once a month or twice a quarter or something like that, and get this ongoing heartbeat of information coming out of the organization.
Hmm.
So that if, say, we had found 80% of teams out of alignment, leadership team is making changes, we might ask a question about that for a couple of quarters to find out, is it working?
Yeah.
And get some more real-time feedback on organizational change activities that are ongoing. And that's the thing that was really missing, was it was a big one and done every year. And it was wonderful, but also in a sense, insufficient.
I love that. That's really interesting. That almost seems like a product.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, like
In
a
fact,
startup.
we had been joking that my little toy app might one day become another New Relic product,
Yeah.
and that it would be the New Relic team agent.
Yeah.
It's the agent not for your code, but for your teams, because humans are a part of the technical system. And if your system of teams is not functioning well, your technical system is going to bear the costs. Your customers
It's
will carry the costs.
it's observability for teams.
Exactly. And there was this thought about that. And then the organizational senior leadership changed and they were not interested in what I was selling anymore. So that was
Yeah.
that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Anything else that you would do differently, or if you took this idea further?
The big one, yeah, is the smaller, more frequent check-ins. The other thing that I wanted to do but never was able to fully build out was building out more of this kind of Atlassian playbook style approach where I could give the line manager, like, okay, like here's the annual checkup, here's your results, and here's the recommendations. And we were very short on those recommendations. I was leaning very much on the fact that at New Relic, we had overall, I thought, an extraordinarily talented group of managers at all levels. And that I just showed them the problems. They were going to be very enthusiastic about getting their hands in there and fixing stuff and talking to each other about how to fix them. Between the skill of the managers and the directors and the VPs and the structure provided by the minions, which were, for people who don't know, it's like the group of peer managers who don't directly work together, just form a little support group. So they meet regularly and talk about what they're facing, but because they're not in each other's business, it is both low stakes and easy to be transparent in that room. Between the regular reporting relationships and the mini M's, I felt like the managers needed a lot less of that direct coaching. And so for most of the managers, I think that was true. And there were some managers who were like, I'm new at the job, or boy, my team's really in trouble here. I need some extra help. And so then I would go in and do essentially lift-off style activities with them to get stuff to happen.
Mm.
And so I think those are the two major changes I would make, is that much smaller, more frequent, cheaper heartbeat of data, get a pulse going, and then build out more of that self-service playbook. And we actually pointed people at the Atlassian playbook because it was really good. So those of you out there in listener land, go look at the Atlassian playbook. It's pretty darn good.
Yeah. For anybody else that's thinking about doing this type of, like doing something like this at their company or organization, do you have any other advice for them of like things they should look at or people they should talk to or anything like that?
Absolutely. Read Dinah Larson's book on Agile Liftoffs. A lot of what she puts in there is about how people come together to make a team. And even if you're not running the liftoffs, there's a lot in there about how humans work. So that was super valuable resource for me. Check out Atlassian as well, super valuable resource. The biggest thing you should do if you're thinking about doing this in your organization is you have to get executive cover first. If you do this as a skunkworks project, people are going to fire you over doing it because you're going to surprise them with information that they didn't know, that they should have known, and how could you possibly have done this? And you're now a threat to their leadership. So do not attempt this unless you've got cover. As you're doing this, you can grow it from a small seed. You can start with a team, start with a handful of related teams under one director, then do it, show the results, show the goodness, and then get other people to see it and be like, oh, that's great. I want some of that, and go viral inside your organization. You can do it like that. And that works if along the way, as you're expanding, you're always invited in. Don't go where you're not invited. It's not going to help anybody. And the kinds of people who are, I think, prone to want to do this sort of work tend to be very sort of activist minded or social justice minded. And that mindset comes with an attitude of setting yourself up in opposition to the leadership. That will not work. You cannot do this in opposition to the leadership. You will get yourself canned. Instead, you have to say, hey, leaders, because of the ways that information moves in these sorts of organizations, I believe that you cannot get an honest report from anybody. And everybody knows this to be true. So here's what I'm proposing is here's a way to set up the annual checkup where you get the x-ray, where we can see what's really going on and you can get an honest report. And I want to do that, but in order to do that, I need you to be bought in. And bought in doesn't mean you're willing for me to do this. Bought in means you're willing to let me do this, you're going to listen to the results, and you're going to take action. The way that these HR pulse surveys most often fail is when nothing changes. If you spend a lot of time taking the survey and you get your hopes up that people are going to listen to you and they don't listen, why are you going to tell them a second time?
Yeah.
And the team health has exactly the same problem. If no action is taken, it's not going to work. So you have to get the senior leaders bought in to fund it, to pay attention, and to act. And if you don't have that buy-in, there's no point.
So it kind of sounds like what you're saying is part of the challenge of doing this is the dynamics of navigating all the different like stakeholders and parties, and like you are serving leadership, but you're also serving people, and you need to be kind of trusted by all the parties and a fair intermediary for all those parties, which is tricky. That's a hard thing to do well.
It is very tricky. And I don't know if I could go into an organization as a new employee and be able to do this and do it effectively. In order to do it, I would have to find who are the trusted people and recruit them, make
Right.
them into my Tiger team so that they have the trust. And then once you can start showing results, people are going to trust you more and be willing
Yeah.
to do that. But you're right. It is hard to navigate. Well, one of the phrases that we used a lot when I was working on this was we described my work as at the intersection of the Venn diagram with three circles, which are the humans, the technology, and the organization. And in my experience, most tech leaders don't realize that the third bubble exists. They just think about the humans and the tech. But it turns out the rules in your org and the structure of your teams and the rules of engagement between teams, how priorities get set, how budgets are negotiated, all of that has an effect on the other two. And for my work to be most effective, it had to be at the center of those three. Because if you ignore any one of those three circles, you're not going to be able to get the right picture.
Yeah, I think it was at that point we coined the term like organizational architect.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was partly because I was on the engineering architecture team. And then when I was doing this work, it's what do we call you? But you're still on the architecture team. So I'm the organizational architect. And it was mildly tongue in cheek, but also not terribly
No, it was
out of
actually
left
kind of
field.
accurate too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was accurate. It was not accurate in the sense that I didn't have any decision-making power.
Yeah, that's true.
As an architect, typically you tell people, no, that project's not happening.
Yeah, that's true.
And I did not have any of that, which made the work harder because it was always these kind of negotiations about, hey, leader, can you do a thing?
Yeah.
And that was hard. And that's not honestly my strong suit. And I think that's part of the reason why I often felt like I was swimming uphill when I was working on the team health.
Totally.
As much as I loved it.
Well, it was super interesting work. I think it was really valuable. You made the whole organization better, and a lot of people benefited from that work.
Thank you. I agree. I think we did all benefit a lot from it. And I think a lot of people learned a lot of things, not just about themselves and their teams, but about organizational dynamics.
I totally agree with that. If people are interested in contacting you about this, first of all, are you open to talking with them? And second, how would they find you on the internet?
Yes, I am totally open to talking about this. However, many years ago, I gave up on the socials because I don't like what they do to me.
Yes.
So I technically have a Twitter account, but I've not logged in I mean, it's X now. I don't think I've logged in 7 or 8 years now. So the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So you can find me, Brent Miller. I'm currently at Scholarly Software, and we are a very tiny company, so there's only one Brent at Scholarly, so it's very easy to get me.
Great.
And yeah, send me a DM on LinkedIn, and I'll respond.
Awesome. Well, Brent, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's been a lot of fun. And what I enjoy about this is it's digging into what I think was some very innovative and interesting work and thinking about that work and where we can apply it into other places. And like weirdly, a lot of that just gets buried and it doesn't live on in any other way. So I love that you're willing to share it and that we were able to talk about it today. So thanks.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to do the work together back in the day. Pleasure to revisit it now. And I hope that other people can learn and pick up some of this practice for themselves. I think that most companies would benefit from something like this.
I totally agree. Well, thank you.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Decoding Leadership. As always, I welcome your questions and feedback. And if you're looking for coaching or advisory help, you can contact me at rubik.com. See you next time.